Chapter 1. Forgetfulness. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. Young people today think of Moby not as the first name of a whale, but as a multi-platinum selling recording artist. He released his first album 22 years ago as a teenager and member of the band The Vatican Commandos. His best-selling album is his 1999 release called Play, which has sold over 10 million copies so far. Born Richard Melville Hall in 1965 in Manhattan, he has always been known simply as Moby. He is a direct descendant of Herman Melville, the well-known author, whose most famous work was Moby Dick. Moby has achieved a great deal of success, and although most young people know Moby's connection to the author, many don't know that Moby is a self-confessed Christian. He says he became a Christian when he was about 20 years old, when a friend encouraged him to read the Gospels. He read them, and that's when, as Moby recounts it, he was converted. I read an article about Moby, provocatively titled, "The Two Sides of Moby, Why He Loves Jesus But Not the Church." While that's not quite what Moby is quoted as saying in the article, the sentiment is common enough and understandable enough. Jesus is a figure of intense interest and even admiration for millions. His stories and sayings still inhabit our minds 2,000 years after he taught on the other side of the globe. He published no books, founded no dynasty, led no army, and governed no nation. But his images and stories and teachings and followers have girdled the globe, presenting a message of a Savior who sacrifices himself out of love. And to most, this is compellingly beautiful. Then there is the church. If you have grown up in a church, you have reasons to be disillusioned. The church seems like a boring topic for most, and a duty reluctantly fulfilled for many. In stark contrast with many of the unforgettable sayings of Christ, we can't remember what we heard in most sermons 10 minutes after we get home. People around the world aren't interested in our church. For that matter, people just around the corner aren't either. Churches have published books and fielded armies and ruled kings, and even so, if you introduce the topic of the church, you'll often find it met with responses ranging from a mild disinterest to a real dislike. We can understand why. Churches say they have the best and most important news in the world. They have the answer to our problems. They are God's embassies on earth. Yet churches are made up of people like you and me, people who are grumpy, irritable, unfaithful, and selfish. We become too possessive of small things and too casual about great ones. We become too defensive for ourselves and ignore God. We talk of love, but we too often give ourselves over to hate, even in church. In this audiobook, we are going to think about this topic of the church and her challenges, using Paul's first letter to the Corinthians as our framework. The epistle has a number of passages that are well known, such as chapter 13, the love chapter, and chapter 15 about the resurrection. In working through this letter, we will be led into important passages on gender issues, spiritual gifts, lawsuits, and church discipline. Much of the letter is taken up with Paul addressing situations specific to the church in Corinth and answering questions put to him by some of the believers there. God had used Paul to establish the church in Corinth during what we call his second missionary journey, which was also his first trip to Europe. Paul spent a year and a half there, likely in AD 50 to 51, working as a tent maker or leather worker and preaching the good news about Jesus Christ. It was probably sometime a few years later, during his 2.5 years in Ephesus, between AD 52 and 55, that Paul wrote this letter. Corinth was a major crossroads between the East and the West, between the southern portion of Greece and Athens and the northern parts of Greece. Ancient Corinth had been destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC,